Hello, my name is Corey Mulliken, and this is my paper, Social Selling and the Differences Between Generation Z and Millennials. I am doing this paper for Marketing 490, and that is at Eastern Kentucky University. A little bit about me. I am the Digital Marketing Coordinator at Bluegrass Community and Technical College, and also a student at Eastern Kentucky University. So, why look at this topic? Well, what really prompted me was realizing how over the past about 10 years, we've seen a lot of research put into the differences between Generation X and millennials, baby boomers and millennials, really comparing these generations against millennial. But now we know that Gen Z is the primary generation. So we need to look at how they are going to be comparing. Are they the same as millennials? Are they different? So that is the primary purpose. Now that gets broken down. So how are our perceived ideas of these two generations actually depicting them? Are we accurate? Are we inaccurate? How do these two generations vary in their copy preference? And how can we better build our social selling practices to reach these audiences? Now, to lay a little bit of groundwork for us, and this is something I will touch on in a little bit, is how we define our generations. So as you can see, we have 5 generations now that we talk about. We have baby boomer, which is the oldest, and the kind of general consensus is 1964 to 1946. We have Gen X, which is 1979 to 1965. Millennials, which is the 80s to 94. Gen Z, which is 95 to 2010. And Generation Alpha, which is 2011 to an indeterminate amount. I think, as we'll talk about, there are certain factors such as events. I think 2020 could be one of those events we use to define a generation. So for right now, I put 2020, but that will probably change. So how much of our population in the United States are made up of the varying generations? Well, we can see that Generation Alpha is, of course, the smallest at only 6.1%. Gen Z and Millennials actually make up 46.2%, which is a nice large number. If we want to break that down, that is Gen Z being 25.6% and Millennials making up 20.6%. And we next see that Gen X and baby boomers make up 47.8%. So, to combine those numbers around, 52.3% of the United States population are younger than Gen X. So, they are a lot more young people than there are older. So now we need to look at the workforce. Well, to no real surprise, we know that Gen Z and Millennial make up 62% of the total workforce, while Gen X and baby boomers only make up 38%. So to put this in kind of raw data terms, there's about 163 million people in the workforce. Gen Z counts for about 27, if we round up, million of those people. And millennials counting for actually 73 million. So Gen Z, of this 62%, it's only about 17%. And there's a bit of a good reason, because about the average age to go into the workforce is 14. And that is United States Department of Labor. So of the entire age range we have for Gen Z, only about 26% of those people can't work. So to kind of better explanation is, There's not a lot of kids out there that are 14 getting jobs. That's the minimum age, but a lot of that falls into farm work and stuff. So it's probably regionally, and I think right now as society we don't really take on that young of workers. So next up we have consumer units by generation, and we look at again Gen Z millennial only make up 31%, whereas Gen X and baby boomers make up a whopping 69%, which is quite a bit. To put that in raw data terms, there's about 164 million consumer units in the United States, and millennials and Gen Z account for about 50 million of those. What is a consumer unit? Because, I mentioned it, but what are they? Well, a consumer unit kind of has three definitions. So it is either all members of a particular household who are related by blood, marriage, adoption, basically by the law, or a person living alone or sharing a household with others, living as a roomer, maybe they're in a home, a housing lodge, or a permanent place in a hotel, but they are financially independent. Or they are two or more persons living together that combine their income to make those joint expenditure decisions. The big thing here is financial independence. So that's determined by housing, food, and other living expenses. So to be considered financially independent, at least two of those categories have to be provided entirely or in part by the respondent. So what this means is that a majority of the money spent in the United States comes from these Gen X and baby boomers, and not Gen Z and millennials. To kind of illustrate this, we can look at how much they bring in. So Gen Z and millennial, on average, brought in $38 million a year in income, and that's pre-tax. When we look at baby boomers and Gen X, they bring in about 79 million. So obviously there's a little bit of a difference in income. We can look at where they're spending their money. So in this consumer expenditure report, we know that Gen Z and millennials spend about $35 million a year on education. When we look at stuff like entertainment, they only spend 33 million. Let's look at those same facts on the baby boomer and Gen X side. Baby boomers and Gen X spent $71 million a year on education and a combined $84 million on entertainment, which means that Gen Z and millennial are actually spending more of their money on education than entertainment. But when we looked at the workforce and we looked at the population, Gen Z and millennial was always holding that higher number. But when we look at consumer units, it's much lower. The best way I can explain this to my best ability is we have to look at the type of jobs these people are probably holding and income levels. So as we know, these Gen X and baby boomers bring in a lot more income, so they're able to make more purchases. They are also more likely to be in higher paying jobs than Gen Z and millennial, and thus have excess income. A fair amount of baby boomers are retiring, so they're going to obviously spend more money on entertainment methods than they are anything else. And that high education number on the Gen X and baby boomers, well, they have kids and grandkids now. They may be paying their kids' way through college. So there's a lot of factors we need to look at. But obviously, Gen Z and millennials still make up a large amount of the workforce and still make up a large amount of the population. So now let's look at the research. For this survey and for this paper, I set out a simple goal, which was let's ask the four primary generations, that's baby boomer, Gen X, millennial, and Gen Z, to identify certain characteristics of advertisings and of generations to see where they see themselves and where they fall. There was about a total of 365 participants, and the rough breakdown of which generations responded is Gen Z responded the most, then Millennial, then Gen X, then Baby Boomers. So I will admit that Baby Boomers probably have the smallest representation in this survey, but it isn't that far off the weight as we saw in population to say we have more young than we do old. So this part of the survey was all about identification. So the generations were asked to look at Gen Z and to look at Millennial and say, on this Likert-esque scale, where do they fall? So I will explain on the areas how it was. So our first question they were asked was about their political spectrum. Do they fall to be completely liberal, completely conservative? Are they neutral? Or are they simply more one way or another? So Gen Z identified themselves as saying they are nearly completely politically liberal. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but understand that just because they said they were completely politically liberal, that doesn't mean it was a 100% response. It was majority. But also, there was no responses saying completely politically conservative. So they do understand that there is still a chance, but it's a whole lot more unlikely. On fiscal responsibility, their answers were actually quite interesting. They said they were neutral. The two spectrums here were either they are very irresponsible or they are really tight with their money. So they'll just buy whatever, or they will take a long time to look into it, to look at investments, to save up. But they found themselves to be quite neutral. Influenceability was another key aspect I looked at. And the simple point of it was, are you easily swayed by someone? Or do you find it to be quite hard for someone to change your opinion? And they actually said they're more easily influenced. Sensitivity was the other big topic. We will talk about a term which is snowflake. And a snowflake is a term commonly used by boomers to baby boomers. There's something we'll get on. A term used by baby boomers to define younger generations, typically, sometimes just people, but it's often aimed at younger generations, that are overly sensitive about everything. So I wanted to see if there's any truth to that. And Gen Z actually said, well, we're not overly sensitive, but we're not thick-skinned. We're neutral. Time orientation was also a key factor I looked at. Are they more likely to focus on short-term investments or long-term? And Gen Z openly said, we prefer the short-term. College was a topic I will look at through here, throughout this paper, throughout this research, but not wholly focus on. I work at a college, so a little bit of me was really interested in this, so I threw it in just for my own interest. I asked them, do you prefer a college education or an experiential education? So going into the workforce straight after high school, or maybe you're in high school and you have that workforce experience already. They were relatively neutral. Some said they really preferred just going straight into the workforce after high school. Others still encouraged and enjoyed the college experience. And last off is, again, one of those typical things we ask about generations, which is, are they digital natives? Do they love digital communications? Well, of course, they said that they completely prefer digital communication. No one ever said they 100% liked in person, but a lot of people were still in the neutral area. So what does this mean for us? Well, we look at the political spectrum and we can say that they probably prefer socially responsible companies and products. They lean towards liberal, so they're going to have a higher preference for companies that engage in activism and that look at a triple bottom line. In the influenceability, we need to also look at how we reach the people. For example, influencers and market mavens. They have a vast majority of all kinds of options of looking at reviews and media sources and data. So it's very, very easy for them to find out about products. Instagram is a really key area for influencers where you simply pay someone to promote your brand. It used to be you pay someone to do a television ad with your stuff. Now it doesn't even have to be a full-on celebrity. I will say that you need to be very, very careful with who you choose to be an influencer. A key example of this is someone by the name of Logan Paul. Logan Paul, kind of a famous duo. His brother's name is Jake Paul, and they are really wild people. They were famous on Vine and on YouTube, and they had crazy antics, often crazy to the point of dangerous. Logan Paul in particular was being paid by YouTube. He was part of their preferred program. Basically, anytime an ad was ran on his channel, he got some of the money that YouTube would normally get. Here's where it kind of starts to go downhill, though. You see, he was in Japan, and he was already causing some chaos. People in the town were hating the fact that he was there, and he decided to go to the suicide forest. I'm not going to get into the full history of it, but if you look up suicide forest in Japan, you'll very much know, and there's been movies about it and all this kind of stuff. In short, people go there to commit suicide. It's a dark place in Japan. The town doesn't like bringing knowledge to it. It's just a really bad place. Logan Paul decided to go in there. There are paths that you are supposed to stay on. He did not stay fully on them. You are told to be respectful and call people if you see bodies hanging. Instead, he filmed a body. And he was not respectful. It was still a jokey video. And it upset so many people. After a very fake apology, Google really got upset and they dropped them from the program for a bit. He was also connected to Disney, and Disney just straight up cut ties with him. But this wasn't the end of his antics. He took part in a Tide Pod challenge after he was off on a 1-month break. The Tide Pod challenge was literally eating Tide Pods, the laundry detergent. He also filmed himself shooting 2 dead rats with a taser. And he was suspended again from that Google program, but reinstated after a couple weeks. Overall, people were teed off at YouTube because they were essentially swatting his hand, and to this day, he is no better. And many people don't like brands that work with him. So keep in mind who you're working with. With sensitivity, we need to understand that you don't need to be afraid to work with Gen Z. You're not going to overly offend them. The key thing to remember is they are in a generation where diversity and being up to date on everything is expected. So they aren't as much easily influenced or easily offended as they are just aware. So if you are not sure of someone's pronouns and you maybe assume someone's male and use male pronouns, that person may not use male pronouns and get offended. And many people often get very caught up in this and say, well, it's stupid, all this kind of stuff. But taking the extra step to ask will have more of a positive influence. And it's nothing really dangerous to you because it's the new societal norms. So they're not overly sensitive, they're just now sensitive to the norms. For example, back in the 80s, if you were to probably hear a whole lot of racist language, you'd probably say something. It's the same way for them. What was extreme back then is now still extreme, but there's new levels. We talk about unconscious bias and all kinds of things that we now look at. When we look at the kinds of orientation for investments they are looking at, keep in mind short term is better. If it is long term, explain benefits and show how a long term investment will overall help you. With college, I typically say look at ROI. College is expensive, so talk about what they get from the degree. That's probably going to mean utilizing alumni. And just show, hey, after college, they are working here. You also need to meet Gen Z where they're comfortable, and that is digital. Obviously, we're in the COVID era, so we've all become accustomed to Zoom. But I will tell you, Zoom is still relatively new. There are several platforms that were around before them, particularly one is called Discord. Discord is a kind of chat room and video room, and it's been popular with Gen Z and millennials for a very long time, so it's just looking into that. So now let's look at the millennials. Pretty much, millennials are a bit more neutral in areas than Gen Z was. They aren't completely politically liberal, but they're more politically liberal. And they are more fiscally responsible than Gen Z. They're also they're less easy to influence. Sorry there. They're also neutral sensitivity. They're not overly sensitive, but they're at that normal level. They're neutral time oriented, so more towards long term, but not favoring one over the other. They're pro college, and they don't completely prefer digital communication. So again, they're not the same as millennials, or millennials aren't the same as Gen Z. So what can we learn from this? Well, just like Gen Z, they care about that corporate responsibility. So having that triple bottom line and having corporate responsibility and initiatives will help you reach them. They're also more likely to look at ROI and reviews before they make that purchase. If you sell a loaf of bread, why is it better than the cheaper one? Keep that in mind when you're about to do any of your work. One second there, sorry. And if you offer a service, just kind of show what savings they might get. Keep in mind that there are a lot of sources of review. Amazon, there's review channels on YouTube, all kinds of places. So make sure you're monitoring reviews, and if you can respond, do respond. An active company will always look good. And you need to keep in mind that they aren't as likely to close on a first encounter. So if you're trying to sell something to them, the first time you meet them, it's probably not going to be the time you make the sale. Just like with car shopping, they don't like to be followed around by that salesperson. So keep that in mind, give them the distance, give them the time. Now we talk about these two generations and the similarities they have. But this doesn't mean that they're the same. They're uniquely different. So this creates what I am kind of calling blurred generations. Generational hybrids would also be an acceptable term. And this is simply where generations have similar characteristics and where people that are born either close to the edge of one or are raised in an atmosphere where they're exposed to multiple will kind of gain aspects of both. You see, I talked about how the years I provided are still a rough idea. Some researchers use events, so a popular one is 9/11, which occurred in 2001, and they say that's when Gen Z starts. Well, that's great and all, and it kind of makes sense, but I was born in 1999, and 9/11 had no impact on me. And I've met people that were born post 9/11, and 9/11 didn't have an impact with them. It also only really impacted people in the United States. So there's issues with trying to make generalizations using events. It's not as concrete as we'd like to think. So I often say that I am a zillennial because I have aspects of both millennial and Gen Z. I'm not completely politically liberal. I'm more. I kind of look at both long-term and short-term investments. So we need to keep in mind that it's not really set in stone. So, for example, I'll use myself as an example. I am Gen Z by definition. My dad is a baby boomer, my mom is a Gen X, my brother is a millennial. Growing up, I listened to music from both my mom and dad's generation. When I watched TV, it was typically from my brother's generation. And when I played video games, it was typically my generation. And stuff on the internet was with my generation. So I've become kind of a blurring of all these generations into a zillennial. Now, there's only really been one other one that's been studied, and that is exennial. They are often called the Oregon Trail generation, and that is because, well, they grew up playing Oregon Trail. So now let's look at how baby boomers and Gen X really look at Gen Z and millennials. Now, if you are to look through my research paper, I also looked at how the total, so basically the impact that adding Gen Z to these resulted in, and I will tell you that Gen Z really leveled the playing field. So Gen Z really was able to identify the others, and same with millennials. So when it comes to Generation Z, Gen X and baby boomers were quite far off. Anywhere you see a line here means they were wrong. Now, there was none where it was fully off. They were typically just more to one area. So by 1 point, in our example down here, how the numbers were working on these. So I really say that they weren't horribly far off, just not close. So to kind of look, we see that they think that they are still closer to liberal, but not completely. They say that they're more fiscally responsible, not neutral. They also think they aren't as influenceable as the others have said. Remember, Gen Z said that they were more easily influenced. They also think that they are more sensitive. Again, that's snowflake attitude. Neutral time orientation was still one that millennials kind of agreed on, that they are still neutral, not more short term. And they also thought there was more pro-college aspects to them. Now, I mentioned snowflake, again, simply a term meaning overly sensitive. And I can tell you many Gen Z were very upset at being called this and tried to flip the coin by saying, all right, instead of baby boomers, you're just boomers. You are someone that has old ideas that are no longer relevant. And it freaked out baby boomers and made them very upset. They said boomer was now slang. And It was a horrible, offensive word. Well, snowflake should be. But hopefully generational gaps will be closed up and people will make friends with each other. So let's look at millennials. Again, as you can see, Gen X and baby boomers really just couldn't get millennials right. They were right in the politically liberal, but they were wrong in fiscal responsibility. They were wrong in influenceability. They said they're more thick-skinned, more long-term oriented, neutral towards college, and neutral towards communication mode. We need to understand that this really just tells us they're different. We don't fully get what they are. And as such, we need to take the time to learn and to understand that we don't know other generations purely based off of our ideas. You need to talk to them. You need to learn about them. Now, it is kind of a trope that baby boomers and Gen X hate millennials, and you often have all kinds of jokes aimed at them. Same with Gen Z. Baby boomers in particular sometimes seem to have a harsh view on them. You can look at comics and jokes. There's a common one where a bunch of kids are in a classroom with books and they say, "I don't understand. I keep swiping and nothing happens." Obviously, kids know what books are. What really is happening here is the differences that have occurred between these generations. We've had such technological advances, and I think they are worried that some of the fundamental stuff from their childhood isn't going to be around. I don't think that's the case. Books are going to be here. Kids still read. But as a society, we are evolving, and we are getting new technologies to make things better. The next area is all about copywriting for ads and talking to them, reaching them through all kinds of methods. So, I looked at 23 slang terms. I'm not going to list all of them, so don't worry, but if you want to look at them, they're in my paper. I asked a member of each generation, explain it. What does it mean? Gen Z knew all, Millennial knew majority, Gen X knew very few, and Baby Boomer practically knew none. I then asked them how they felt about using it in copy. They almost all said negative except for Gen X. When I actually looked at the history of these words, and I noticed that a lot of them came from the LGBTQ community, I kind of realized that there's a lot to go into, and in my paper, I do go a bit more in depth about that. To put it in short, the terms and slang that Gen Z and millennials used have probably been around since Stonewall, which would be in baby boomers era. And it comes from AAVE, African American Vernacular English, and the drag community. So they are deemed normally heavily gay words, if you will, which is probably why they were not as popular in Gen X and baby boomer eras when being openly LGBTQ was not accepted. The next big thing to look at was community representation. So I asked both generations, how important to you is it to see representation of the following communities? You can see Gen Z and Millennial pretty much said it's very important regardless, with only a moderate in women in jobs. Gen X and Baby Boomer tended to be very back and forth, with some extremes, some not at all, and in LGBTQ, extremely and not at all. Literally, the answers were purely binary on that. There was no middle ground for them. Really, what this shows us is that Gen Z and millennials are much more expecting of the community representation. So they less see of it as an advertising method, but just as an expectation. Whereas Gen X and baby boomers are still very keen on we need more of this or less or none of that. The best way I can describe some of this is many of these communities have become politically based or politically charged. So, referencing current events, there are many murders of African Americans in America right now by police. The Latinx community, there are many people that politicize their being here, whether they're illegal immigrants or not. LGBTQ is almost constantly in the news, whether it's their right to have kids through adoption or even the legality of their marriage. Disability is less of an argued one. Middle Eastern still has stigma from 9/11, even though it was only a very tiny, small percentage of that group that was engaged. Women in hijabs often are viewed as being oppressed women, but in reality, it's merely their religion and no different than Catholic nuns. And the Asian community, especially right now, is in a lot of pain because, well, without getting too political, our president has dubbed the coronavirus the China virus. I also want to look at ad content. To kind of give you a quick example, Carl's Jr. ran an ad during the Super Bowl to advertise their all natural burgers. And while if you ask any advertising expert what is something that represents all natural, you'll probably hear green, fruits, vegetables, trees, all that kind of good stuff. The people over at Carl's Jr. thought breasts, particularly women's breasts, and they had a naked model carry different burgers in front of her breasts. She'd go up to cantaloupes, and it was honestly quite trashy, and a lot of people took offense to it. Uh, it was not clear until about 28 seconds into the ad that it was for a burger, and many people boycotted the company saying women are more than meat. So we need to be a little bit understanding. We know that sex sells, but we need to know that our generations right now are less keen on that, and they rather you use anything else. So I looked at all these different topics. So profanity, I typically would say this falls under the ad of Kmart's Ship Your Pants. Uh, Wonderful ad where basically Kmart makes fun of the fact that you can ship any item to store, and they said, hey, you can ship your pants. That's kind of under the mild, it's not really big swearing. Profanity of hard would be dropping the F bomb. What we really see here is kind of Gen X and baby boomers are negative towards everything, whereas Gen Z and millennials are more accept of anything non PC. Now, the sexually suggestive imagery probably comes at that a bit of sexual freedom that the Gen Z and millennials have. So that's probably where that comes in. But I think with them, it's also pretty assumed. Nothing overly sexualized. And they do like dark humor, which is very common in Gen Z specifically. And why is that? Why is Gen Z fine with dark humor? What is dark humor? Well, to kind of put it simple, Gen Z is been around through a lot of dark stuff. So dark humor is stuff we don't joke about. That's depression, that's suicide, school shootings, you name it. But when we look at Gen Z, there was a report done by the American Psychological Association, and they said that 75% of Gen Zs had a fear of mass shootings. 91% said that they had experienced at least one physical or emotional symptom due to stress in the past month, and only 37% of those actually seek counseling. Keep in mind what Gen Z has grown up through. They've seen some of the worst school shootings. They have gone through rampant police brutality. They have gone through horrible things happening at the border walls. They've gone through wars. They've seen recession. They've really been through some of the darkest times in US history. So they kind of use comedy to make fun of that. If you look at Gen Z humor, you'll easily see that they make fun of dying a lot. So it's no surprise there. But obviously, that does not land well with Gen X and baby boomers. So, purchasing habits and social media. I want to look at how these groups are divided on where they make their purchases on social. And what we really found is the generations buy more off of the platforms that are aimed at them. So Facebook is typically aimed at an older audience, and we can see the older audience bought more. Instagram is aimed at that younger audience, and the younger people bought off of it. Twitter, which is kind of, I'd say, more aimed at millennials and specific, millennials and probably Gen X, we can see that several people, not as many, bought off there. LinkedIn, which is again an older audience base, has been more popular with the older audience base. Pinterest, which I typically say aims at middle-aged women, was more popular with people who'd be in their middle age or older. YouTube, which currently I'd say aims more at younger audience, popular with its younger audience. Now, other kind of has a lot on there. So on this end, it was typically stuff I would not have included. It was things like I bought off a Facebook group, a yard selling group, or, well, I bought off Craigslist. Those aren't really social media sites. On the flip side, Gen Z and Millennial were very honest, and they said they bought off porn websites. So that is what they decided. And I did have one person say TikTok. So why does all this ad stuff matter, right? I mean, we know how to make ads. Keep in mind, Data USA provided some wonderful data about marketing managers, and they found that the average age is 42 years old. That's Gen X. If you remember how our older generations were viewing millennials and Gen Z, they weren't fully correct. So they may not be the best authority on what's going to stick with these younger generations. I real quickly want to talk about memes, and there is a full definition of memes that is provided by Merriam-Webster. And I don't like the definitions. They provide two, and I'm going to choose the best, which is an amusing or interesting item, such as a captioned picture or video, or genre of items that is widely spread online, especially through social media. That's an awful description. I typically say it's a funny picture because not all of them have words. But memes can go wrong fast. So you'll see two here. The one on the left is President Xi, the current president of China. The one on the right is Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. People made fun of the president of China for looking like Winnie the Pooh. China retaliated by censoring Winnie the Pooh. And if you are to do Russia, any memes in Russia with public figures, you may get punished. How? It varies. So please, if you're going to use memes, keep in mind the format. So I typically say have pop cultures, have animals, but be very careful. Keep in mind what is its background. There are some that people use, and I'm like, oh, that's from a show that's really risque. So research if you need to research. Make sure it's up to date. So if it is, a meme that you just saw used, it's good. But they're called dead memes that just aren't relevant anymore. Don't go about sharing those. And if you need to look at those, explore Reddit and Instagram. So down to recommendations. I did 2 case studies kind of showing how some of these recommendations were put into place by other companies. And again, at the end, I will go through my paper, contact info for my paper, so you can read through it there. So, first off, I want to point your attention to this graph here. And this was a very common graph I found. As you can see, the black bars here are the total dollar spend on advertising, and this little red line shows what percentage of that is digital. As you can see, they were expecting a decline. I say COVID has probably boosted that line up. I know I just saw a story about political ad spending, and they said it is now a lot more. So I'd say this is going to start trending upwards as people have started to see the importance of digital advertising and reaching those younger generations through digital means, because that's what they prefer. So we need to understand that Gen Z and millennials may have similarities, but they are different. So don't go about treating them the same. And that a person's age or event that they lived through does not determine what they will fall in. Sometimes they may be that hybrid zillennial or exennial that we talked about. Focus on promoting short-term investments to Gen Z. That's just something they enjoy. Don't have to worry about too much about what type to go to those millennials. Promote that experiential learning in your classes if you are a college. So highlight those internships, clinicals if it is a nursing program, or labs in any kind of science program. You need to incorporate those practical usage for degrees in your advertising. So talk about where someone with that degree has gone to work at. And so it kind of just comes around to use those alumni stories. You need to make diversity regular in advertising, make it less of a chore and more of just a regular thing. Never use Gen Z slang in advertising. The one exception, 2 exceptions I really found was if you're an LGBTQ company. Again, that's just the root of those slang. And if you are willing to make fun of yourself for using it. In my paper, I explore what's called the cool mom effect, and it's how using those terms can negatively impact you. So just be aware, making fun of yourself really is only a good way to use it. KFC is a good example in the case study of making fun of yourself. Keep your copy clean and tame, so don't go too heavy in profanity. Remember, negative was pretty much down the line of that Gen X, and it was neutral down the line of Gen Z, so it's not going to hurt you to play it safe. Memes can be used, but be sparingly using them. Don't overuse them. Make sure they're relevant. All that wonderful stuff. And you need to realize that different generations are on different social media sites. Again, I went through the list to kind of run it down quick. Gen X and baby boomers are on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Pinterest. Gen Z and millennials are on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Snapchat, and Reddit. Now, I didn't talk about 2 particular sites on here, and that was TikTok and Reddit. TikTok, they're going through a lot of legality issues right now. Talks about being banned in the United States. They're also majority database, not necessarily database, user base is non-American, so they are, I think, primarily Chinese and Indian. So keep that in mind. This paper really looked at United States, so we'd be looking at a small portion. And Reddit is great, but in advertising terms, I have personally found that there's no real benefit to advertising on Reddit. So thus its exclusion here. So if you would like to read through the full paper, and you want to look at the references, go through the appendices to see my methods of research, the questionnaires, and the full list of 23 slang words, you can contact me at corey.mulliken@kctcs.edu. My full name is Corey Lee Mulliken, so you should be able to reference me. And my phone number is 502-337-4486. You can just send a quick text saying, hey, I love a copy of your paper. Can I have it? So thank you for being with me on this journey through my paper, and I hope you find some good use from it.